Welcome everyone to The Cutting Edge. My name is Dan Hatfield. I am the CEO and one of the founders of Edge Growth. So I've been in this space for what's coming on to 1.5 decades. And when we talk about shared value, which is the topic for discussion today, 10 years ago no one was talking about this. And now you won't go a day or see a newspaper where it's not brought up. And for that reason, I'm really glad to have Heather Lowe with me here today. She has been in this space almost as long as Edge and myself. She has been with the F&B group and is now head of SME development for F&B business. And she got into the space over 10 years ago and has been wrestling with this concept of shared value. So really feel grateful to have Heather today. And first of all, I'd just like to ask Heather how she got, I'll use the word suckered into the space, because 10 years ago, really, it wasn't something which everyone was looking at as a potential career or a passion, and you found yourself here. So welcome, Heather. And if you could just start off by telling us a bit about you and how you got to be in SME development.
Thanks, Dan. So I have quite a long banking career, basically across the retail side, and then in the business side, 20 years with F&B in particular. And basically, my career was a lot around the relationship management side and acquisition of new clients in the business bank space. When the code started emerging, it became obvious the bank really wanted to focus on the non-financial support wasn't even around at that time, hadn't even been conceptualized. And they really needed somebody who had experience with working with SMEs and understanding what the challenges were, particularly through their funding and their growth, and what the non-funding challenges were. And I think I was very young and eager and ambitious, and kind of put up my hand to do it. And it has been incredibly difficult, but I feel that the space has evolved a lot. And it's great to work in a space where you're not just working for a corporate salary, but you actually are able to have a higher purpose. So yeah, just that's my background, and landed up with Edge along the way, which has also been great. But I feel like, yeah, we've been able to do a lot of work in shaping the space to be more impactful.
Yeah, and I mean, this concept of shared value, it feels like it's emerged over time, but we've always been doing something which is related to shared value. So can you give us a view around how you see shared value or how you might define shared value?
So I think that there's lots of definitions and many of them are very theoretical, but basically when you synthesize it, it is the notion that everybody in an economy and society should benefit, because ultimately if a corporate or any entity is operating in an environment where it is detracting from that environment, socially, economically, environmentally, the environment will not be sustainable, and that corporate will ultimately not be sustainable. So basically, a corporate or any business, through its work, should be uplifting and delivering value to the ecosystem within which it operates. I mean, that's from the existence of buildings. Are you actually pumping fumes into the air, to which suppliers you use, to the impact that you're having on your customers? How are you using your resources, human resources? I mean, it even goes to the well-being of your staff. So I think that the main issue, though, is really around the intentionality versus sort of side effect.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit about this word intentionality? It feels like there are a lot of examples of shared value out there, but they're almost a function of doing something for a different purpose, but yet that benefit is being achieved. It feels like this concept of intentionality has become front and center, and almost the fact that you're wanting to do something and you're measuring it starts making it a lot more clearly shared value. If you can just help me understand, how intentionality plays into shared value, and whether you define something as shared value or I'm doing something for a purpose and it's an unintended consequence that we get a benefit.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with getting like cool impact as an unintended consequence. But I think that if one is really going to almost herald themselves as having a shared value strategy, that needs to embed itself into the way that business functions. So when somebody is developing a new product, it's not just around, cool, how much money are we going to make? How does the product work? Like, how much is it going to cost us? There should always be that component of what shared value does this create? Is there another opportunity for us to actually maximize or increase the shared value that it can create? And the check of, does this detract from an unintentional perspective in any way, shape, or form? And if you have that discipline across your entire business, I think you can safely say you're being intentional. But if you're sort of adding it in as like a compliance checklist at the bottom and then almost just telling a good news story, I feel like that's slightly different to really embedding, the concept of shared value into the core of your business.
And it sounds like it has to happen from many different directions in an organization for it to work. So just in terms of understanding who needs to have this on their agenda for it to actually work and happen, how does it cascade in an organization? It'd be helpful if you could theoretically give us a view around, who it's important for and whose agenda it should be on, but then actually just practically, where have you seen it work when different people are driving it and kind of collectively you get good outcomes?
So I think that obviously it needs to be an imperative at a board level and at a senior stakeholder level. And also it needs to really feature on the CFO and financial function side, because sometimes it could be a trade-off situation, which does obviously have financial implications. So my sense is from a very strategic perspective, it needs to be a solid decision and it needs to be backed by the appropriate individuals who are controlling the checkbook, and also the individuals who are almost signing off on all of those components. Where I don't think it works is when it's an add-on or a side. So yes, CSI and philanthropy does create shared value, but I think that when one's looking, and you can be intentional about putting a pot of money aside to do that, but if you're wanting to leverage your entire resources in your business, then I feel like your senior management who are actually implementing in their various functions every day, from HR across to products, across to risk, actually need to have it on their scorecards. So ultimately you really start driving the achievement of those objectives, and it's top of mind for everybody as they do it.
So what I'm hearing is it almost has to be taken on from a matrix perspective.
Yeah.
Like you can have specialists in the business
Yeah.
who are subject matter experts and they drive how it's done. But unless it sits in the core business and across kind of everyone's scorecard and agenda, it typically gets diluted and ends up being something on the side.
Yeah, I think it fragments if it's not driven with the same almost rigor as everybody is held accountable to it. So obviously, like an example is obviously everybody is driven by revenue generation and sales, and every single individual probably has some component of that on their scorecards, and that's why organizations are really good at that. But the same discipline of how are you going to get the outputs, well, you actually have to incentivize it and you have to measure it and you have to manage it. It should apply to this as a business discipline.
Okay, so it feels like maybe we're preaching a bit to the converted here. So I want to ask you, where have you actually seen it work in a business? Because I think, although this sounds good to a hardened capitalist, they might say, well, actually, this is a tax and it's ultimately taking away from us doing, what we should be focusing our time and attention on. And so examples are helpful to show that actually, like everyone wins, including sort of the economic picture of the business, if you get this right. Do you have anything which you can help me sort of navigate why this is not a tax and actually it's really good for core business too?
So, I guess there's two components, right? So one component which is, and I'm going to speak within a financial institutions context because obviously, that's the environment that I know best. Financial institutions need multiple investors in order to capitalize us so that we have sufficient deposit holder funds. And obviously one wants to be able to getting that investment at rates which are conducive to us making money. I think that there is an awareness internationally around this concept, and it might come down as governance, ESG principles and a whole reporting sort of concept. But I think that where it could potentially be something which ultimately starts hitting the bottom line is if you are able to incentivize your clients through the manner in which you lend to them to behave better, that could be an opportunity for us in what we do, which is lend money, to actually influence our client base to institute shared value. So what is an example? Well, if we know that, for example, a business that we're lending to is exploiting certain categories of labor, is not environmentally safe, a number of things, maybe, their procurement function is extractive. We could incentivize them with preferential rates, like a scale of rates, because you're actually a better contributor to society, and therefore you're actually a lower risk to us in the instance of reputational risk. But if you are then able to demonstrate that your lending activity and you as an institution are holding those principles true, you may well attract investor funds at a decreased cost.
Capital.
And that ultimately is bottom line. If you look at the SME angle, well, SMEs are definitely a part of shared value, although it does seem to have been very over-talked, SMEs, job creation. But as a bank, if we don't have enough SMEs growing, who are we going to bank in the future? So I think that some of these topics are actually really starting to lead to core business. The power situation, if we're not assisting government as a financial institution to address our electricity problems, well, half of our small businesses who happen to be our customers are going to fall over. And what is that going to do to our balance sheets? So I think that there's some very real examples which sort of show that some of these things are not just somebody else's problem to deal with, and all corporates can collectively contribute.
So when you first entered the space, it was around about 2008, 2009, and it came through this aspect of the BE codes called enterprise and supply development. And largely that's been your focus in terms of how you've looked to drive shared value in the business and the greater economy. How do you see ESD either being a sub-segment or linking in or being related to shared value? Is it the same thing? I think that because it's almost the way in which shared value is introduced to many stakeholders, struggling to kind of see the relationship and how it can be helpful. Can you just help, with that concept? I think a lot of our listeners will be trying to marry it.
So I think that, obviously ESD is specifically aimed at the transformation imperative. And the whole legislation around the BEE codes was meant to institutionalize transformational behavior across all business components. So ESD only being one pillar, but meant to drive the transformation agenda in core business in the way corporates operate in society to uplift previously disadvantaged and excluded participants and to try and get this equality. Now, obviously, if you're looking at the concept of shared value, there's probably a lot of theories which technically divide, but ultimately what you're doing is you're addressing inequality, you're addressing poverty, which results from the inequality, you're addressing inclusivity and access to a whole lot of things. And those things cannot possibly be not shared value. So I feel like ESD does address shared value, but with a specific focus on the equality component, as opposed to other shared value things speak to the environment and a lot of other components like health and welfare and well-being. So I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a subset. I would go so far as to say it's definitely a more intentional form of driving one particular critical aspect of shared value.
And And have you seen some examples within the ESD space where you really feel like it's a poster child for what shared value is meant to be?
So and obviously I'm going to go to what we're doing. I think that one of the very interesting things that, again, I feel like we started with some intentionality, but we've definitely honed our intentionality and learned a lot of lessons through unintended consequences as we've kind of gone along. I think this concept of social enterprises is actually a big one. And it speaks to a number of these components of shared value, even outside of ESD. So basically supporting and growing through various forms, being funding, being education, being access to markets, enterprises which are actually serving society and scaling them speaks to SME growth, because obviously a social enterprise has profit. I mean, it's not an NGO, so it has a sustainability element. So it speaks to SME growth, speaks to unemployment resolution, but at the same time, you're also bridging the gap between some of these service delivery issues. So helping the economy, helping government, but just doing good within communities for society. A lot of these social enterprises operate in rural environments when there isn't access to a number of these services, like water, as an example. So I think that that's one where there's a very definite overlay of enterprise and supplier development, as well as it then moving into a space where it creates shared value, because a lot of these businesses are innovative. They're bringing new revenue into spaces. It's not just another Me Too. And then obviously the benefit of the upliftment of the community is there as well. So I mean, off the top of my head, I think that's one example.
I mean, the other thing which I'm just seeing more and more is that businesses that do good because of what has happened around the customer base, and the customer base being socially conscious, are good businesses and are actually, they've got fundamentally good entrepreneurial opportunities because they're serving a market that's aware of this and actually sees the value in what they do. So it stops becoming you've got to focus specifically on a business that does good because it feels like the right thing to do, and more because those are fundamentally good businesses because of the way the markets are developing.
Yeah. I mean, I think another example, Dan, is the impact investing landscape, because that really is around the availability of funds, which is rare. I mean, funding is a resource which is not just available to anybody, and actually dedicating funds towards businesses that are essentially doing good and generating value for society is also a great example of where we've seen it working. Impact investing has only really emerged over the last, 8 years. But is probably much bigger internationally. I mean, we're still sort of quite a small piece of that in its infancy here. But I think that that's another example of where it is working to try and drive the right outcomes.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to the unintended consequences of ESD around shared value, but we're just talking a little bit about measurement now, because it feels like a lot of these concepts are a little bit intangible, and surely the next question is, well, how do we measure this? How do we make sure that we create standards which drive the right sort of behavior? It's an economic opportunity, so people are being opportunistic in the way that they're looking at the space. Any thoughts around how it's done, some of the difficulties around doing it?
So I think, again, we need to go back to the intentionality, because my question would be, how are you going to measure something when you never actually set out to do it in the first place, right? So that's like kind of the departure point. I think that what you probably need to be looking at, and there is a lot of intangible in it, but, obviously what inputs firstly are you trying to do to try and change something? What is it that you're trying to change, and what is it that you're hoping to achieve as a result? And it's very rudimentary, and it probably is going to be incredibly flawed when you start to measure it. But I think that as you go through the process of trying to measure and trying to quantify, as crude as it might be, you are able to almost circle back and sort of add more rigor to it. So I mean, example again, when we first started, we were like, how do you measure whether a program's added value to a business or not? Okay, we look at the revenue, we look at the profit, and we look at how many jobs they've created, but is that all? And for a long time, that's what we measured. But then what happens when you actually have to pull a business back to make it grow? Because maybe they're costing completely wrong and they're actually making a loss. Well, now you're going to pull their revenue back. So does that mean that the program's not successful because you actually had a revenue decrease? So I think that an example of that is where you're starting to notice those behaviors and you're then starting to identify other opportunities to measure other components of the business and how are they progressing, and start implementing things like diagnostics so that you can start understanding variations. And I think that those sort of tools will sort of emerge in the shared value space, and there actually are many of them. The problem comes in your systematization and operationalization of that, because ultimately, we've all got really great reporting systems, functions when it comes to commercial activity and when it comes to operationalizing our core business. But typically, I think that there's going to have to be some investment into the data chain and the measurements ultimately, because otherwise it's always a little bit vague. If you're not getting the data from hard sources, it's always going to be storytelling as opposed to actual measurement.
Yeah, that's been my experience, is that, typically people end up going for case studies.
Yeah.
They're very emotive. It feels like, it's showing an example, but it does feel anecdotal. But yet getting hard data, from the businesses, I mean, in this case, SMEs who've got day jobs, is really tough. And then I also think that there's a limited understanding of theories of change, So it's one thing measuring it in a very isolated context, but what is this doing to like the broader system? I mean, I don't know whether, you feel like you've got any thoughts or tips or hacks around how you kind of transition from it being quite isolated to sort of more systemic. I know it's a big challenge that everyone's wrestling with.
So I mean, ultimately, the attribution story is very interesting, because none of these things are linear. And often, as you say, you have an unintended consequence, which can be negative or positive. So, I mean, you might think that there is only one factor which is influencing what you're doing, and therefore, if you get that right, you will get a certain outcome. But there's actually, in reality, multiple factors which are applying pressure, all the time to the system that you're trying to work within. I mean, I think that it's very hard, and it's going to evolve over time as more and more people start doing it, Dan, because, I mean, even if you look at the application of funding in isolation, I think we need to start looking at the whole ecosystem. So if we're looking at it within an ESD perspective, the whole ecosystem of aspects which affect a business, including the macro, right? Because everybody's pushing access to funding, access to preferential funding, access to high-risk funding. Should you be funding businesses that actually can't repay it? Are you then not leading to an over-indebted society, which leads to banks sort of starting to fall over, right? So I think that it needs to be viewed within the macro of what's happening, the macro of what's possible, currently growing at a certain GDP. How on earth are we going to be, expecting other factors to move? And then taking into account, you're not going to get the attribution perfectly. So access to market, that's measurable. I mean, like, that is clearly measurable. Funding in isolation doesn't necessarily grow a business, because if you give it funding and it doesn't have access to market, well, then what? And BDS is the same. I mean, you can do BDS until you're blue in the face. If there's not a scalable business model, or if it's not appropriately funded, or it doesn't have customers, it's not going to grow. So I think it's about understanding the ecosystem as broad as you can get it, and then almost measuring all of those components, even if you're not trying to intentionally drive them. At least be conscious that they exist and that they're not bringing in this massive delta. And you think that what you're doing is actually driving it.
Yeah. I mean,
it's complex.
Interestingly enough, the other day we had an opportunity through sort of a think tank, to contribute to the president's view on how we could enable the SME environment to be more impactful, to massify the impact, as he calls it. And one of the hard parts of that conversation was, what can we do almost felt tactically about the SME environment without addressing kind of the broader macroeconomic environment, because these things are so interrelated. But if you were to kind of wave your magic wand and maybe take two lenses on this, like first of all, like what are the things which you would like to change about sort of the SME environment and see more of in the SME environment specifically? I'm happy if you kind of go to legislation or you go to behaviors, and then maybe just certain kind of bigger macroeconomic levers that you also think would unlock that. And maybe some of that stuff, is what everyone's talking about, like, electricity, etc. But just, touch on whatever you think is appropriate, both sort of more at the SME space level and also at the sort of macro level.
So look, I think that at the SME space, I think that let's speak about the SME first. If I could wave my magic wand, I would want, so I think that the term entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs is almost diluted. Like not everybody is an entrepreneur. Some people are actually starting businesses out of necessity, and that means they have a very different worldview, not necessarily these massive scalable businesses. So I would kind of want the component of, let's identify like who those really high growth businesses are and they're serial entrepreneurs, and almost which are the necessity based. Sometimes they need different forms of support, and sometimes the forms of support are very, very basic, but because it's not sexy, nobody's doing it. I also think that there needs to be a proper overhaul of all our incubators and accelerators and educators. And we've been saying this for a long time. We have so many developmental institutions, yet we are where we were. And surely, if so much money and effort and time has been put into, trying to surround entrepreneurs with support, trying to give business development support, we should be further along. So I think that there would be some kind of standardization of what is good, what is successful. I think that we need to institute proper measurement methodologies into how these numbers are reported. I mean, nobody gets to just report their financials as they wish to portray them. So it should be the same with impact. There needs to be some kind of methodology which is benchmarkable, because there's a number of different ways that you can actually show revenue change. I mean, it could be projected for all we know. So I think that some of those aspects will make sure that we have people who are skilled, appropriately experienced, and have, it's almost like, and then the narrative is, would you actually go and learn brain surgery from somebody who's never done brain surgery? No, that's not how it's done. And then I'm kind of wondering why that's okay for the SME environment, right? So that's kind of. Then on the other hand, the SMEs really need to know that they don't know everything, and there's a lot that they don't know. So know what you don't know and be open and coachable, because I feel like a lot of really great businesses are, and understanding that, business owners are subject to a lot of pressure. But if you want to succeed, you have to be open to input and be open to people's previous experience and always be learning. And I think that we see a lot of that not being present. So it kind of feels like some of that burden needs to actually be carried, by the SMEs themselves. It's not easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. You have to put in the work. And that risk-reward relationship, like you can't just stand and go, give me money, give me access to market, tell me how to run my business. You play a critical part in that, and you have to pull your weight. From a legislative perspective, everybody is so regulated. There's so many forms of regulation, from the NCA through to labor, through to, it just becomes very challenging to try and do something outside of all the legislation that exists. And I mean, I think that,
on that, any like key aspects of red tape which you would just say, change that, something kind of come up here. I know that the way that we, contentious point, the way that we hire and fire.
It's crazy.
In South Africa is very different to a lot of the nations that have got, the entrepreneurial environment working. That's one. I mean, anything else?
I was just about to touch on that. I mean, look, a hiring decision which has gone wrong, or a hiring mistake, I think most businesses know is like one of the most expensive mistakes you can possibly make. And when your labor process makes it so difficult to actually, fire people, not that we want to, but it just puts a massive burden on. So the hiring and firing story, definitely, the amount of labor legislation. But then I also think, just even in terms of like the levels of compliance of everything is really tricky. And the service delivery in terms of those levels of compliance. So if you could just do it very easily, I don't think it would be a problem. But in a lot of these instances, maybe the organizations that are actually like providing the services of getting people registered, etc., are not efficient. Yeah. And that then lands up with these huge gaps where people are just sort of standing still. From a sort of private sector perspective and government, I really think that corporates need to be procuring more, and I know that everybody says this, but it's difficult because there's efficiencies, there's risk to be considered, and in a post-COVID environment...
Procuring more from small businesses.
Yes, absolutely. So when you look internationally, the countries which are actually procuring a lot from small businesses are the ones with the lowest unemployment rates. So we kind of hovering. Some do it better than others, but I still don't think that we're there in terms of the whole inclusivity component and being able to move those businesses up the chain. And it's really difficult, and it requires the intentionality we spoke about, because you are going to have a higher risk. You may have some inefficiencies in the beginning. And it doesn't look the same as we've always done.
So what's the business case? So that you get more innovation, you get more agility. I mean, have you seen examples of where you've actually got a smaller supplier into the supply chain, and it's helped you be better at your business?
So I think that definitely the agility is one component, and you spoke to the innovation. I think though, it's a difficult one just because I think that we have so many people who are starting businesses which are similar, and it is very difficult to innovate a commoditized product. And so much of, like corporate procurement in many instances is so commoditized. So, it just is what it is, and it comes down to this pricing component, but you don't have all these millions of documents in order. So seriously, we're going to go with one which does. I feel like in a lot of these tech spaces where the businesses are starting to move becomes really exciting, and that's where the SMEs are bringing a lot of value because they are so agile. And there's that entrepreneurial mindset, which takes a long time to get stuff happening in a corporate. So your health tech environment, as an example, there's a lot of agility that's coming out with a lot of innovation in those spaces. So I think that it's in pockets, but I do think that unless you've got corporates which have these almost corporate venturing or innovation labs, the innovation is going to come from the small guys who are conceptualizing and have agility, but then they need to have funding to take their products to market. So sorry, that was on the procurement side. Like, we really need to buy more from these businesses, and it really needs to be intentional. It needs to be authentic. And then macro, look, there's a lot of issues plaguing. I mean, there's electricity, it's water, it's the health system. It's just like all over. And I think that a lot of these are more interconnected, than we think. So, even stuff like access to affordable internet, it is an issue. So you might be trying to develop SMEs, but now, firstly, they've got load shedding. Secondly, they can't afford their data. Thirdly, that like the sort of
you overlay the pressure of being remote nowadays, and it's
it just like starts escalating. And I think that all of those macros sort of contribute to those. So if I had a wish list, we would just have proper service delivery. We would have proper access to data and connectivity at an affordable rate, which is equal to everybody, not just people who have the money to buy inverters, and all of the other stuff that I kind of spoke to.
More market level. So I'm going to come back to ask you, what could government and corporate do to incentivize more shared value behavior? But before that, I think we should just talk a little bit about the unintended consequences. Again, marrying ESD with shared value. What have been some of the things which you've seen in the ESD space which have actually felt like they've been counter shared value because of the fact that you've got a set of legislation that's trying to drive a particular outcome, and either it's abused or it has a particular agenda, and therefore it can be contradictory? I don't know if there's anything that comes to mind there.
So I think that the main thing that we've seen is survival of businesses. Sorry, this one's very harsh. Survival of businesses which should not survive, and like that's not great for the economy, because ultimately you start then seeing anti-competitive behavior. Now, I mean, like from a global competitive component, like from a global perspective, when you don't really have to compete and you can just be mediocre, I think that is one of the unintended consequences, because it's almost like people have to buy and people have to spend money, and if they don't do that, then
safety net
they're
doesn't push the
penalized.
excellence, so you
So I
drop the lowest
feel
common
like, and
denominator.
it's a very generalist statement, but I kind of feel like that does impact maybe our competitive perspective. And then maybe sometimes the innovation does suffer in certain pockets, because again, this company buys X amount, they have to buy from X number of people. It's kind of like it becomes a little bit of a me too. So I feel like, we land up with a lot of really commoditized businesses, each with little pieces. I think the other thing that we're seeing is the shifting. So there's not necessarily new economic value being created, new jobs being created. We're taking from A and we're giving to B, and those people go from there to there. So I think that those are maybe some of the unintended sort of consequences of that I've seen sort of playing out.
And, going back to the previous question, does it feel like to get more people on this shared value bus, there's things which corporates can do, need to do, things that governments can do, need to do, or any other stakeholders?
So I think that, Dan, incentivize is the appropriate word as opposed to penalize.
Yeah, or legislate.
Or legislate, because I think like everybody's just so tired of multiple almost taxes, multiple reporting, multiple penalties. I think that maybe there are levers that government can pull which reward those that perform, which then starts driving that behavior from a positive perspective. I mean, people don't react very well to negative stick. You have toddlers, you can see this all the time. But if you wave a chocolate in front of them and it's a reward, that starts driving the behavior, and it starts even creating the competitive environment to excel at that. So
it's more a principle of how it's incentivized versus managed. So maybe just one of my last questions. I mean, you've been in this space for 10 years. Like, what gets you up in the morning? I know you kind of started off coming into this space because you felt like there was more than being a corporate banker. And it wasn't called shared value then, but in a way that's been your agenda. So I just really like to hear, how the last sort of 10 years has felt, and whether you're still excited and enthusiastic about, what you're doing, and whether you feel like, you're getting cynical for being in the space for this long because you're maybe not seeing that, or there's green shoots and there's optimism.
So I mean, I think that it's hard. It's hard. Anybody who says the space is easy is lying outright. It's incredibly difficult, it's incredibly frustrating, and you're always moving against the tide because it just isn't the way things are done. So I think there is a level of cynicism which does emerge. You kind of forget that at one stage you were that bright-eyed, bushy-tailed person who was like, this is so innovative, we're going to do this and we're going to change the whole world. And obviously you've learned the lesson, so when somebody else comes, you're kind of like, no, you're not going to change the world, let me just tell you that. But I still think that, so for me personally as a human, I get bored incredibly quickly. So the fact that there is always a new problem every single day to solve, still 10 years later, is probably what keeps me going. But just because there is still so much work to be done, and I think there is still so much cool stuff that can be done, even though it's slow, like I still want to get there, or feel like I've got there, even though the goalpost keeps shifting in my lifetime. So I mean, that's like kind of what keeps you moving. And I mean, I do think that there is a level of cynicism, but it kind of becomes a little bit of this, well, then you actually look back and you look at the world and you're kind of like, geez, the inequality is still such a massive problem. You see the waste picker guys like pulling, and you just realize that if you're not going to play a part in actually trying to do that, nothing's going to change for your kids. Nothing's going to change for the better. And you're actually privileged to be in a position where you have a big corporate behind you, although it comes with all of its issues. It's much more powerful than trying to do it on your own.
Yeah. And what are some of the needles that you feel like you've seen shift a bit, in this time? Like just things which you feel like actually, we really like we've done something, you know, and it shows shared value.
So I think, we really were on the cutting edge when we started setting up SME venture financing funds together with you guys. I mean, Vumela was the first one, no matter what anybody says. And it's still standing, and it's on portfolio 3, where a lot of them have shut down in the meantime. So personally, I'm very proud of the fact that we definitely opened up and deployed a catalyzed funding that was just not available for earlier stage SMEs. And I feel like we created a systemic effect and catalyzed replicable models. So the fact that people copied it is absolutely great. So that's the one thing that I really feel that we've done well. And then when I look at the likes of the programs that FNB have done with and without you, I really think that we have managed to continually evolve those programs. We never run the same thing. We always implement new learnings, trying to make it better, trying to get there. And I think that we've really seen some amazing successes that have come out of constantly pushing those boundaries in terms of how much we've actually been able to grow businesses, and like literally how much access to market those businesses have been able to get, and visibility, which has then allowed funding to start climbing in, and ultimately how many people's lives have been impacted directly and indirectly. I mean, when you consider that, many people, some of the employees are supporting 8 to 9 dependents. Now, in the absence of some form of income, that's all dependent on social grant. The country's already hemorrhaging, social grant in this whole pandemic environment. So I would say that on those 2 components, I really think that we've moved. And I think that we've actually created a standard in the market of what good looks like.
Well, I just want to end by saying that we are incredibly fortunate to have you in this space, someone as passionate as you and knowledgeable as you. And it's been a privilege working with you. And I think, as you say, it's just the beginning. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. I just want to say that whatever platform you're listening on, we'd really appreciate it if you subscribed, and even better, if you leave a comment. We'd love to keep evolving this, and we really do care about, what you think of this, and, we'll try and ensure that the value keeps coming. So thank you.
Follow our podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, where we will be releasing a new episode every 2 weeks. Or subscribe to the Edge Growth YouTube channel to catch the conversation.